Well, my name is Kirk, and I'm the lead pastor here at Living Hope this morning. And I want you to do something with me this morning. I want you to think back to a memory of a conversation that you had with someone where all of a sudden there was an outburst of emotion. Maybe that was your emotion. Maybe it was someone else's emotion. Maybe they yelled at you. Maybe you yelled at them. Maybe there was a burst of tears. Maybe your tears are theirs. Who knows? Do you have a memory of something like that where you walked away from a conversation where there was this outburst of emotion, and you wondered, where did that come from? Have you ever had that experience? I remember once I was managing a team of IT professionals a number of years ago, and there had been this request that came in from a customer. And they made a request of my team, but unfortunately we couldn't grant their request. And so I made my way down to their office to talk with them, and I was going to tell them, I'm sorry, no, I'm afraid we can't do that. And I walked down the hallway to their office, and their door was open. They were sitting at their desk. I knocked on the door to get their attention. And as they turned around to see me, their face suddenly changed. It wasn't that happy to see you face. It was that, oh, you face. Ever experienced that? I probably should have turned around right then and there and walked away, but I kept plowing forward. And I said to this customer, I said, you know what, I'm sorry you've made this request, but I'm sorry the answer is no, we can't do that. And I explained why. And then all of a sudden, I realized no was not the answer they were looking for. You know how I realized? Because all of a sudden they blasted me. They started yelling at me at the top of their lungs, berating me, insulting me, saying all sorts of things to me. And I was just shocked. And you know what? This was a small hallway when there was all these offices around. And suddenly all these open doors suddenly started to close, because nobody wanted a part of what was going on in that hallway. In fact, the guy's boss was actually, his office was right next to him, and he was in the office working at his desk, and I saw out of the corner of my eye, I saw him get up from his desk, and he walked towards the door, and he gave me this sympathetic smile as he closed the door. Even he didn't want to deal with this. And it went on for a little while, and then suddenly he yelled at me, "Get out of my office." I wasn't even in his office. I hadn't made it through the threshold of the office, but I still took a step back because he leaned over and slammed the door in my face. And I remember walking away embarrassed, frustrated, upset, and wondering, where did that come from? Has that ever happened to you? Where you've just suddenly been blasted by somebody's emotional outburst? You know, sometimes the crazy finds you, and sometimes you are the crazy, right? Because it doesn't just happen to us. Sometimes we're the ones that do it. I remember a few years later, I was working in my office, and I was listening to a conversation going on down the hallway as one of my team members was being pressured by somebody else to do something that they really didn't want to do. And I was sitting there listening to it all, and suddenly I got up and thought, I will come to their rescue. Big mistake. And I walked out and I started to have this conversation. I took over the conversation, and within a few minutes it turned into yelling, and I was the crazy person this time, and I was the one where people were poking their heads out of the hallway and closing their doors behind them. And one person came down the hallway and they suddenly turned the opposite direction and started to go the other way because they didn't want any part of what was going on. Sometimes the crazy finds you, and sometimes you are the crazy, isn't it true? Have you ever had this happen where, you know, I was reflecting later at night and I was thinking about the day and I suddenly asked this question, where did that come from? Why did I respond that way? Have you ever asked that question? We've probably all been experiences where there is emotional outbursts. Maybe it's anger and yelling. Maybe it's tears. And we come away and we wonder, where did that come from? Because the level of emotion that was expressed was not appropriate for the situation we were in. Or maybe we were in a highly charged emotional environment and we felt nothing. We felt numbness. And we still need to ask that question when we feel that emotional numbness inside of us. Where did that come from? Why is it there? We've all experienced this at one time or another. And you know, sometimes we ask that question, where did it come from? But sometimes we just blow right past what happened, don't we? You know, we apologize to the person we yelled at. We said, sorry about that. I don't know where that came from, but I'm really sorry about that. And we just hope that we can move on and move past whatever it was that caused that disruption that happened. Or maybe there was an outburst of tears and we think, okay, well, we can just get past this. Nobody saw me. Or we run away because we're so ashamed at what happened. And we live such busy lives that too often we have these experiences with someone else or with ourselves. And we don't pay attention to what's going on underneath. We don't ask where that came from. Instead, we blow right past it. We hide, we run from it. We don't deal with what's going on under the surface of our lives. And here's what I know happens, though, from experience, is that when we don't deal with these outbursts, when we don't deal with the things that's causing these outbursts, it always comes up again. You see, what's under the surface always comes back up again. And we're starting a new series today called Under the Surface. And in this series, what we're going to be talking about are the things that are deep within us that just keep coming back up again, that we just keep doing again and again, because here's the problem. The things that are under the surface that we don't even know about or we can't see, these things are keeping us from relationship with each other, and they're keeping us from deeper relationship with God. And so we're going to talk about, over the next 9 weeks, a number of deep issues, things in your soul that need to be worked on. And I hope you'll be a part of this. And today we're asking that question: where do those emotions, where do those outbursts, those experiences that we have, where do they come from? And thankfully we're not the first to wrestle with this question. In fact, Jesus wrestled with this question with a group of people. And we're going to look at what Jesus had to say about where these things come from, these things that shock us, surprise us, shame us, embarrass us. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Matthew chapter 12. We're going to look at verses 33 to 37, or if you have your phone, you can look up it on there. You can grab a blue Bible when you come in every week, and you can follow along with me so that you can see for yourselves that these words are actually in there. I'm not making them up, that Jesus actually said them. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus is dealing with a group of people called Pharisees. Pharisees are religious people, just like you and me. They want to have a relationship with God. And Jesus has this encounter with them where he heals this person who is mute and blind. And the Pharisees see what Jesus did, and they have an unexpected response, just like you and I have experienced from time to time. They have this outburst where they suddenly declare, Jesus must be evil because he healed that man. I mean, come on, really? He just healed a man who was mute and blind, and they say that he's evil. And Jesus says this to them in verse 33. He says, make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. Jesus uses two metaphors in the passage that we're going to look at to describe what's going on under the surface of our lives. The first metaphor is of a fruit tree. He says that make a tree good, and it produces good fruit. And the metaphor here is that the fruit are the actions and the words in your life. The tree is your life. And the fruit is what everybody sees, the actions, and what everybody hears, the words. And he says that a good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. Sounds simple enough, right? You know, when we accept this metaphor, a lot of times what we try to do when we have these unexpected moments where there was an outburst or we did something that we weren't happy with, you know what we try to do? We hide the fruit, don't we? We pick the fruit off the tree and get rid of it before anybody can see it. We pick the fruit and try to get it off so that nobody saw what we did, nobody heard what we said. We try to hide everything there. But do you know what happens when you pick fruit from a tree? It grows back, right? Doesn't it? Am I wrong? It grows back. And if you pick an apple from an apple tree, what happens? It grows another apple, right? It doesn't suddenly grow an orange. And we spend a lot of time trying to cover up the fruit that's on the tree, to pick it off the tree, get rid of it so nobody sees what we did. But the problem isn't the fruit. It's deeper than that. You see, getting rid of the fruit doesn't get rid of the problem. It just covers up what happened. And the problem is actually deeper than the fruit. The problem's in your soul. What's your soul? Your soul is this place where your emotions and your memories, your character, your perceptions, your intellect, and your faith all combine to become who you are. And what flows out of your soul determines the fruit that you grow. And so by covering up the fruit, or by getting rid of the fruit, it makes no difference about what's going on in your life, because the problem is deep down within your soul. Sometimes we try to get rid of the fruit, but sometimes we take more drastic measures. And maybe we say, you know what, I got to just change my life. I got to put up some boundaries, and we try to cut off an arm of a tree or a limb of a tree, and we think that that will get rid of it. But friends, it's deeper. It's in your soul. This is where that outburst came from. This is where that emotion comes from. These are where the reoccurring sins, the problems that we have in our life come from, deep within our soul. When Britton and I were first married, we would get in an argument from time to time. We never argued till we got married. I don't know what's with that. I think she saw me for who I am. It was always my fault too, which is the honest truth. It is my fault all the time. When we first got married, we would have arguments. And these were doozies of an argument. And at some point, Britton would get up and she would begin to walk out of the room. And I would have this visceral reaction, this physical reaction to her walking out of the room. And I would get up as well. And I would follow her and I would keep talking. And you know what happened? The arguments would get louder and they would get longer. And it never solved anything. When my oldest daughter became a teenager, she started to do the same thing that her mother did. We'd have an argument, me and Alex, and she would get up and she would walk out of the room, and I would have this reaction within me, and I would follow her, and the argument would get louder and longer. My son, who's 7 years younger, when he became a teenager, we started to have arguments. And he would get up and he would leave the room, and I would react. When my youngest daughter became a teenager, do you see the pattern here? In fact, I told you about that argument where I was sitting in my office and I got up and started arguing with somebody who was pressuring one of my team members. Do you know why it started? Because the person walked away from me. And you see, I had been doing lots of things over the years. I've been reading books. I've been memorizing verses. I've been praying about it. I've been trying to deal with the fruit in my life. But the problem was deeper. It's in my soul. And until I dealt with the thing that was in my soul, I couldn't change the fruit, the words and the actions that were coming out. You see, until we deal with the roots, the root cause of what's coming out of our mouth, of what we're doing with our hands and with our body, our actions, until we deal with the root cause, it will not change the fruit. I had this neighbor. We lived in Calgary. And this neighbor had this huge poplar tree. It was planted about the same time that the house was built. And this poplar tree now dwarfed all the houses. It was taller than any house in the neighborhood. And the neighbor decided that they were going to cut it down. And so I watched as he dealt with the branches and cut the branches off. I watched as it was cut down piece by piece, and the trunk became smaller and smaller and smaller until it was at the ground level. But the neighbor didn't deal with the root system. Do you know what happened? The next summer, I had a poplar tree growing in my driveway because the poplar tree had a root system that went throughout the neighborhood, and it came across the street and pushed up through my asphalt drive-through. Hopefully that doesn't happen out here. That's what happens when we don't deal with the roots, when we just try to cover up the fruit. Jesus says, a good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruits. And he keeps on saying to the Pharisees, he says this, "You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good?" Boy, that sounds harsh, doesn't it? I'm glad he's not saying that to me. It sounds harsh. Where's the loving Jesus that we like so much? Where's the nice guy, right? You brood of vipers. Friends, Jesus is not angry at these people. Jesus is not lashing out at these people. Do you know what he's trying to do? He's trying to get their attention. It's like saying, hey, what are you saying? Because they've just watched as he healed somebody and they said to him, Jesus must be of Beelzebub. He must be of the devil. And Jesus is like, what are you saying? Do you hear the words that are coming out of your mouth? You brood of vipers. And Jesus isn't angry at them. He doesn't hate them. What he's trying to do is get them to pay attention to what's going on. And they are so locked into their mindset that he has to use some hard words to get their attention, to say, look under the surface of what's going on in your life, because where did those words come from? You can't say anything good. I just changed this man's life, and you can't say anything good. Where is that coming from? Friends, he could be talking to you and me. He could be calling us a brood of vipers, because too often we blow through life and we don't deal with what's under the surface. We just figure, that's how I am. That's who I am. Just take me as I am. And Jesus says, you brood of vipers. What's under the surface? What do you need to deal with in this? We need to pay attention. And Jesus goes on and he says, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man or an evil woman brings evil things out of the evil stored up in them. This is the second metaphor that Jesus uses. And the metaphor is that of your heart being like a storage cellar, a root cellar. When I was a kid, I would go over to my grandma's house, and she would send me down into the basement where she kept all of her canned goods. My grandma, we lived in Hamilton, and there was all sorts of orchards around, and she would make canned fruit for us. And she would send me down, go get a can of peaches, which I loved. And there were on all the shelves were all of these cans that she had made up. And I would bring that up, this treasure that I had. Maybe you grew up on a farm and you know what a root cellar is, where all the goods and the foods are kept in the cool underground. Or maybe you've been to a winery and you've seen a wine cellar, and you know where all the valuable wines are kept cool in a safe place. And Jesus says your heart is like a wine cellar. Your heart is like a root cellar. He talks about the heart, but here's the thing. You can interchange heart and soul. What we would call as our soul today, they would call as the heart back then. They're interchangeable. So your soul, your heart is like a root cellar. And Jesus says that what comes out of our soul are the things that it's full of. You see, a lot of times when we have this emotional outburst or we have this situation or we do something that embarrasses us or that we regret, we think there's just a little bitty thing in our soul that we need to deal with. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says your soul's full of it. He says it is out of the overflow of the heart in some translations. Out of what the heart is full of, what your soul is full of, is what comes out of your mouth. And it's interesting language that Jesus uses here. He says some translations are out of the excess of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Or what the heart is full of, the mouth speaks. The word that we use in that phrase, it's one Greek word. And the same Greek word is used 7 times in the New Testament. And it's always used to talk about surplus, excess, extra, abundance. In fact, the gospel authors, when they talk about the feeding of the 5,000, they use this word. Do you know the story of the feeding of the 5,000? Jesus is teaching these people, 5,000 plus people, and they're hungry, and they didn't bring anything to eat. And so Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds over 5,000 people. And then after they had all eaten, it tells us, after everybody had had their full, not just a little bit of something, but actually their full, then his disciples, 12 men, went and collected 12 baskets full of the excess, the overflow, the surplus, the abundance. This is the same word that Jesus uses when he talks about what's in your heart. You see, the truth is there isn't a little thing. It's that your heart is full of it. Your soul is full of it. You see, over the course of our life, our soul is a lot like a root cellar where we keep putting things and storing things. And we put it down there time and time again. And all of the regret that you have is stored in your soul. All of the guilt that you feel is stored in your soul. Maybe you did something. You betrayed someone. You hurt someone. Maybe you're the only one that knows about it and it gets locked away in the root cellar soul of your life. Or maybe you were hurt. Maybe you were wounded. Maybe you were abused. Wasn't your fault. You didn't ask for it. Maybe someone died and you feel that loss. Maybe you've been hurt or wounded over the course of your life and you bury it in the cellar of your soul and it stays there. And Jesus says that it's out of the overflow of our soul that our words and our actions come from. See, it's not a little thing. It's actually a big thing. And Jesus says we need to deal with those things. We need to identify that source. It just, because it'll keep coming back up. And here's the thing, your heart lies about it. Jeremiah says that the heart is deceitful above all else. Your heart lies to you. It hides the truth from you. You see, you think you've dealt with those things long ago. You think that everything is okay, but you have these reoccurring fruit that keep coming out of you. You know how you know? If you've changed relationships and the same problem follows you, it's not them, it's you. If you've changed jobs and the same problems keep reoccurring and you keep finding yourself in the same situation, it's not the job, it's you. If the same thing keeps happening and you keep asking the question, why does this always happen to me? It's not on the outside, it's on the inside, and it's deep within your soul. And your heart is lying to you about it. Because the heart is deceitful above all else. But here's the good news. Jeremiah also says, who can know it and who can understand it? And the answer, friends, is Jesus. You see, why does Jesus respond to the Pharisees like he does? There's a verse earlier on in the passage that says that Jesus knew their thoughts. He knew that what they were thinking before they ever spoke. And Jesus knows what's in your heart. And he wants to help you. And Jesus goes on and he says this to them. He says, but I tell you that everyone will have to give account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. Does anybody feel anxious after hearing those two verses? Anybody besides me feel anxious about those two verses? I mean, careless words, accountable for, oh my goodness, because sometimes I don't even think about what I'm saying, and I get in a lot of trouble. And Jesus isn't trying to scare you, he's not trying to scare the Pharisees, but he is trying to get them to pay attention to the words that they've just spoken to him. Think of it like this. At the last church that I was with, I had this role where I was the media relations person, which meant from time to time that the news or a reporter would call, and they would call about issues of faith that they would want a comment from someone who worked for the church. It was a large church, and I was the point person for talking with them. And the reporters, they were doing their job. There was nothing nefarious. They weren't out to get me. They were just reporting what I said. The problem is I say stupid things sometimes. Ask my wife, ask my kids. I say stupid things sometimes. And now here I am, the point person, where every single word that I utter gets written down and put on the air. You know what I did? I had to slow right down and begin to pay attention to the words that I spoke. When the reporter would ask me a question, I would pause. I wouldn't respond right away, which is how I usually do. I'm usually like this, but I would pause. And I would think about what I want to say and what I don't want to say, because everything's on the record. And this is what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. Pay attention to the words that come out of your mouth, because they're revealing something that needs work in your life. Pay attention to the things that you do again and again, because they reveal something about you. You see, here's the thing. Based on everything that Jesus said, you know where your truest self lies? Your truest self lies in those moments when things aren't going your way. Your truest self is not the person that you put forward 24/7. Your truest self is the moments when you aren't at your best, when you are stressed, when you are yelling, when you are dealing with things, when you are in tears. That is your truest self, because it's out of the overflow of the soul, out of the cellar of your soul, that you're bringing up the thing that you're serving. And this is your truest self. So pay attention to those moments. Jesus says, live with intention. Listen to what you're saying. Look at what you're doing. And ask the question, what's underneath that? This is the invitation that Jesus has. And you know what I see in here? I see in here that Jesus isn't scared to ask the hard questions. Jesus isn't scared to point out the things that need to deal with in your soul. You see, Jesus is more interested in your relationship with him than with your comfort. We would rather be comfortable. That's why we try to hide the fruit that we pick. That's why we try to cover things up and push it underneath the surface, because we'd rather be comfortable, but Jesus said, I'd rather have relationship with you, deep and intimate relationship with you. So pay attention to what's going on underneath. What's going on in your soul? Think of the last time that you yelled at someone. Think of the last time that you burst out in tears. Think of the last time that you felt no emotion at all at a moment when you probably should have felt emotion. This is your truest self. This is your truest self. Now, what does it say about you? Where did it come from? And our heart lies, and our heart tells us easy answers. But friends, if we will dig beneath the surface and listen to the Holy Spirit, we will find where it comes from. And we will be able to change our lives and become what Jesus envisions. So how do we respond to what we've heard today, to what we've read that Jesus has said? Well, I think there's two valid responses that we could have today. The first one is the response of the Pharisees, the people who were there that day when heard what Jesus had to say. And they went away and ignored everything he said. That's a valid response. You could walk out of here today doing that. You know, you're at a certain age, and maybe you've lived this way your whole life, and this is who you are, and I'm just going to ignore everything and walk out. That's a valid response. You could choose to do that. Here's the thing. Here's what I know. What's under the surface always comes back up again. And while you may have lived all these years, be they few or be they many, with what's in your soul, Jesus is inviting you to pay attention to what's under the surface. And if you don't, it's just going to come back up again. It's just going to keep coming back up again. It's just going to keep coming back up all the time. And it becomes a barrier to relationship between you and God and between you and the people around you. And we were created to live in relationship, up, in, and out. Up with God, in with ourselves, and out with everybody around us. And what's under the surface, buried in the root cellar of your soul, is keeping you from becoming what Jesus envisions. So while it's a valid response to walk out of here and say, I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to do what he says, I don't suggest it's a good one. But there's a verse in Acts chapter 15 that kind of intrigues me. This verse says that within the church in Jerusalem, there were a group of Pharisees that believed in Jesus. Now, I don't know if these Pharisees were there that day and they heard Jesus say these things, or whether there's another group of Pharisees, but this verse gives me hope. It gives me hope that people who were so shut off to Jesus, who passionately wanted to know God, but were shut off to Jesus, at some point after the resurrection, they came to know Jesus personally, and their lives were changed. And that means there's hope for you and me, if we will pay attention to what Jesus said. You see, those Pharisees who came to believe in Jesus and were a part of the church in Jerusalem, at some point in their life, they decided to take Jesus at his word, that he was who he said he is. They decided to take Jesus at his word, that they had something in their soul that they needed to deal with. And that gives hope for you and me, because maybe today, we could begin to deal with what's under the surface of our hearts and our soul. Let me give you a question to ask. Over the next 9 weeks, we're going to begin to probe deeper into our soul and deal with some of the things that are causing these issues in our life. But for this week and go throughout the series, really, I want you to keep this one question in your mind. In your bulletin, there's the sermon notes, and on the back of the sermon notes, there's a picture. It's a picture of this tree. And across the tree, it says, what's underneath that? And we've designed this so that you can put it up on your fridge, you could put it up in your cubicle, you could put it up in your car, you could put it up in your garage, wherever it is, on your sewing table. I don't know where you put stuff. Eric designed it. He put it like on the fridge like his mom would do with his piece of art, okay? And whenever you see it, let this be a reminder to ask the question, what's underneath that? When you respond with too much emotion, when you respond with too little emotion, when you respond with emotional numbness, ask the question, what's underneath that? And get to the root of the problem. Don't just deal with the fruit, get to the root. Whatever it is that's buried in your soul, pay attention to it. And here's what I want you to do. Ask that question and then ask the Holy Spirit, who knows your heart, who knows what's in your soul, and listen to what he has to say. And let him bring to the surface things that need to be healed. Let him bring to the surface things that he's been wanting to deal with in your life for decades. And become what Jesus envisions. Over the coming weeks, we're going to ask everybody in the church to get into a community group, to begin to discuss what I'm talking about on Sunday, to dig deeper into the scripture that we're talking about, to figure out what's going on underneath the surface. There's discussion questions today on the website for this sermon. You could form your own community group. But over the next 9 weeks, lean into this. Just like Jesus is leaning into relationship with you, and ask the question, what's underneath that? Imagine what might happen 9 weeks from now. Imagine what life might be like if you dealt with things that have just kept reoccurring and reoccurring and reoccurring in your life. If you let the Master, Jesus, come in and clean up your soul. Imagine the relationships that might be restored. Imagine the life that you might have. Imagine how you might just become what Jesus envisions through a simple question and listening to the Spirit. What's underneath that?